Hello and welcome. Greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. It is Friday, and so it's time for our week in review. For those of you that are new here, every week our offensive security team is basically combing through the interwebs of things to try to find stuff that we think is important for you to understand and learn about in the cyber world. And so, we just want to present that to you and give you information that will make you a little bit more prepared for tomorrow than you are today. So you've got Mr. Spencer or somebody, I actually don't know who he is, and then myself, Brad, from the Offensive Security Group. So do you want to take it away, Mr. Mystery Man?
Yeah. So so can you find me on LinkedIn, right? I just converted my LinkedIn over to a creator profile. So I have all these cool things now, apparently, that creators do. So
neato.
Yeah.
Right.
Follow us on LinkedIn if you like this. Like Brad said, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Helps us reach more people and kind of share our passion with the world. So today we're talking about password snooping, supply chain, and Clop ransomware. So the first kind of item on the list is password snooping. And this is something that I think is super interesting as I bring this over here. So something that's super interesting is threat actors, adversaries, they love credentials, right? An attacker gets on the network. Most of the time, they're going to want to deploy ransomware or do some other things. They need credentials to move laterally throughout the network, right? In order to do that, they need to get credentials. And one of the ways, the traditional favorite way to do that is to get them by abusing LSA, or the local security authority. They abuse LSAS, the LSAS process, right? If you're familiar with kind of some of these offensive techniques, you can dump credentials from LSA, right? And from the LSAS process. So the reason this particular technique is interesting, we'll get into it in a second, is it's getting harder. Defender is getting really good at protecting LSAS. Other EDR products are getting really good. Carbon Black, CrowdStrike, et cetera, are getting really good at protecting credentials in memory. So threat actors know that. So they're trying to come up with unique ways or different ways to get those credentials. Now, this is one of those ways I think is super interesting. This is an approach or a technique that was first developed by Gregor Tworek, and I apologize if I say that name wrong, who's a security researcher. But he's developed this technique to essentially kind of get in the middle of the Windows logon process. So the TLDR of what's happening here is a user provides their login credentials in something called WinLogon, and that runs a program that reads the registry, and it loads several DLLs that are referenced in the registry. So that the reason that's interesting is that you can modify the registry, you can modify those lists of DLLs, and essentially kind of load your own DLL in that process. So when Windows is notifying the system that, hey, somebody's logging on, you can get into the middle of that process, and you can save those Cleartext credentials to a file if you want, or do whatever you want with them. So that's why this is interesting. It kind of is before any of the cryptography happens. It gets the Cleartext credentials, and it doesn't touch the LSA yet. It doesn't touch anything else. So it's an interesting kind of technique.
Yeah, and the old methods of gathering credentials, like you said, they're kind of becoming less and less common. This is a new twist on an old technique, and I will say it is a little bit of a wake-up call, I think, for those of us who manage secure endpoints, to say that just because you've done a good job on the front end of hardening that endpoint, that's not the end-all be-all. In this case, we would hope that EDR style monitoring on these endpoints would pick up these registry changes or pick up the behavior or the malicious DLL. But again, it's just part of a defense in depth strategy to catch something like this.
Yeah, and this technique, as far back as I could find, was 2020, I think, was around when this security researcher released this technique. Mm-hmm. And since then, it's been relatively quiet. I think the article that I have referenced in the show notes here by Huntress, which is a really good article, by the way, super good, super detailed, but also high level So really good article. But essentially, this technique has really been the first time, according to Huntress and their team, it's the first time they've seen it kind of abused in the wild in this way. So super interesting to see, but I think this might be a trend going forward, like you said, because it's getting harder to attack those credentials in memory. Attackers are going to find different ways to get those credentials, whether it's man in the middle or keylogging or phishing, whatever. They'll find a way, and it'll be different from abusing LSAS.
So is this something that you're going to roll into your internal pen testing methodology?
I would love to. I mean, this is kind of gets into social engineering in a little bit of a way, because it relies on somebody logging in to that machine. So if we incorporate some red team aspects or some phishing or something like that, or if we just sit and wait, this could be a component that you include on a pen test, definitely on a red team, right? It's kind of reminds me of putting something we've been doing for a while, and pen testers have been doing a while, I should say, putting files on network shares with a link to like the responder host, right?
Yeah.
Like those suspicious LNK files and stuff like that. So dropping those suspicious files on a network share and just waiting for people to come across them.
Yeah, I like it.
It kind of reminds me of that in a way, where you're configuring something and you just got to sit and wait for something to happen.
Yeah.
But definitely an interesting technique nonetheless.
I could see this being used on a larger scale pen test. So if you get like server level admin privileges and you want to elevate a little bit, and you just kind of sprinkle this thing all throughout the environment.
Yeah.
But, at some point you're just creating a ton of work for yourself to clean up at the end of the pen test. And for what?
Yeah.
There are other ways to accomplish the goal. So
yeah, and it doesn't really take advantage of a vulnerability per se. It's just a feature in Windows. It's just the way the Windows works.
Right. Thanks, Microsoft. Cool.
Yeah, so thanks, Microsoft. So I'd be, thinking to myself, what would be, what's the remediation for this, right? Or how do we prevent this as defenders? While, there's not necessarily a good way to prevent it, there's ways to forensically identify it, like after the fact, but also detect it. There is some things you can do to kind of help detect this, and they mention it in the article here. Elastic has a query that you can kind of emulate to detect this, and essentially you want to look or monitor for manipulation to the network provider in the registry. So that's a good place to look. That's ultimately where these DLLs have to be manipulated, is in the registry. So monitoring those sources would be a good way to detect that. But it can be hard, right? It's not an easy thing to detect or prevent, for that matter.
Yeah, it does look tough. There's no doubt.
But one of the ways you can help too is, restricting where admins log in, right? Don't log in with domain admin on a regular user account, or a regular user computer, I should say. So defense and depth strategy really, really helps here.
Understood.
Cool. So the next one I think was an interesting development as a result of Black Hat and DEF CON. That was just...
there were some great talks this year, by the way.
There's a lot of good stuff, a lot of good research. Did you see the John Deere hack? Somebody hacked a John Deere.
Yes.
There's actually a really big story behind that. Maybe sometime we'll have to cover it, but there's like a whole bunch of drama and like stuff around John Deere. It goes back to, I guess, farmers being able to like fix their own machinery, and John Deere not wanting them to, kind of what Apple tried to do with like fixing your own Mac and stuff like that.
Yep. Yeah, they got a lot of hate for intentionally configuring their equipment so that your average Joe can't work on it, which is always a sad thing, right?
Yeah. So interesting story. We'll have to cover that sometime. But
Definitely.
In this case, one of the cool talks that came out of Black Hat and DEF CON was this Realtek SDK vulnerability. Now, a little bit of backstory on this. For those who aren't familiar, Realtek is a software development, they're a microchip manufacturer, right? They make circuits, they make firmware, software for integrated circuits. And they're commonly found in like audio codecs, in a lot of computer peripherals have Realtek firmware, right? But also routers have Realtek software in them, Realtek firmware and chips. So it's fairly common. Realtek's a fairly common manufacturer. The issue here is that there's a vulnerability in Realtek's SDK, which is their software library that all these things use, right? And the software is very common. Like I said, it's common in home and small business routers. It's common in audio codecs, less so in enterprise environments, but still fairly common. Now, the vulnerability itself, I'll let Brad kind of talk a little bit more about why it's interesting, but Realtek has made patches available, but not all vendors have included them in their products. So they haven't really deployed those firmware patches yet to their products. And the reason we wanted to talk about this is it's just yet another example of how troubling supply chain can be, particularly with IoT devices and things like that. So definitely an interesting thing. It's kind of something that's flown under the radar, but I think is pointing to a larger trend and a big impact kind of thing.
Yeah, this thing is fascinating, not necessarily because it's another IoT instance of a vulnerability, right? We see these so often now that we're almost numb to them. What makes this interesting is, number one, it's undetectable from a defensive perspective, i.e., you can't go do a Nessus scan on your device to determine if it's vulnerable to this particular attack. And so basically, you just don't know that you have this issue unless you just try to attack it, or you do some low-level reversing on the IoT device itself. And so that piece is fascinating to me. These are relatively unusual in this world. But the biggest thing of all, at least in my opinion, from all of this is it just re-illustrates how difficult this problem is and how prolific it is. And what I mean by this problem is upstream development that's out of your control, i.e., supply chain, right? And also IoT, and the combination of the two. A lot of these systems can't even be patched. They're just how they are forever. There's no disk. The firmware is hard coded onto the board in a lot of cases. And so it's unbelievably difficult. This thing will be out there basically forever.
Yep.
There might be a few really super awesome vendors that get out there and do something about it, but this isn't going anywhere.
Yep.
Realtek can't do anything about it because, they can't go unbuild whatever was built with their SDK. And so anyway, it's just super fascinating because, there are a lot of these out there, and these things, Realtek being as prolific as it is, this stuff's in like Department of Defense. This stuff's in, highly secured, air-gapped environments. Like, I mean, dude, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. Yep. And there's nothing you can do about it other than, do really extensive testing on your own of every individual thing that you buy, which nobody's going to do that, right? It's impossible.
Yep. Yeah, and there's cases of, these IoT devices that had firmware upgrades, or they come out, there's vulnerabilities for them, and the manufacturers of them or the creators of the products are just essentially say, well, we're not going to update these products, so just get rid of them and buy the new ones, right?
Right.
There's been cases where they just say they're not going to support those old vulnerable devices. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting things with this, but definitely going to be a trend we see going forward.
And the only way you fix this, in my opinion, right? Because I'm sure everybody's going, well, why are you even talking about it? There's nothing we can do. It even says it in the title. There's not much you can do about this. Is you have to push back against these vendors on the front end, right? During the procurement process, you need to be asking questions like, how do you guys provide updates to your products? What versions of SDKs do you use? Give me a manifest of the hardware components that you use and what testing you've done. And so in my previous life, that was part of my role, was to coordinate with vendor management and the procurement department to evaluate individual products that we were bringing on board and adding to our portfolio. We would evaluate them for security. And in most cases, it was asking for a pen test, right? When's the last time you guys did a pen test? And I want to see that pen test show me the scope that includes the version of the product that I'm buying. And 25% of the time it was like, I'm sorry, we haven't done that. And we're like, okay, so we're going to figure out how to get that done. We have to, as consumers of these products, start asking hard questions of the vendors. And if these vendors start losing really big contracts and really big sales because they don't have answers, the landscape will change. But we have to do that collectively as a cyber entity across all markets, which I don't know how we coordinate that, but whatever.
Yep. Well said.
All of that just well said.
Well said. No, and that's what it is. I mean, until we as consumers and, like you said, entities force these vendors to raise the bar, it realistically won't change. It's not going to be, there's no incentive for them to change otherwise, right?
Yep. Agreed, 100%.
Cool. So the last story is about Clop ransomware. And this one I thought was kind of interesting. The Clop ransomware gang hacked a UK water treatment facility or water supply company. They claimed that they hacked another company. So they actually hacked a completely different company. It was completely unrelated to the facility that they actually hacked. So the facility that they hacked was South Staffordshire.
I couldn't say it either. It took me 3 tries.
Yeah. Then we should have had a guest on from like the UK or something, I guess.
Right.
The company that they claimed to hit was Thames. Thames is much larger, a much bigger kind of water facility organization than the previous one. And it's really kind of unclear whether they did this intentionally to stir up drama or what the reasoning was behind it, or if they just didn't realize they were in the wrong network. We kind of saw this a little bit with the Colonial Pipeline attack. Like they weren't really sure that they hit what they hit, and there was some issues with that or some speculation there. But in this case, they stole like 5 terabytes of data from this organization. They shared the information on their dark website, and they posted a whole bunch of information. And it shows quite a bit of sensitive information that they are leaking. And there's some kind of takeaways for me from that we'd like to discuss. But one of the things that I thought was interesting is, they said they could change the chemical composition of the water, but they said they weren't interested in causing harm to people. And that's kind of like, that's the age old saying of ransomware gangs. It's like, we don't hack hospitals, we don't hack critical infrastructure, we don't want to hurt anybody, but here they are hacking this company and causing real damage to them. Mm-hmm. But interesting case of kind of a mixed attribution thing, and I thought was interesting to talk about.
Yeah, what do you do when you're the wrongly accused company, man? That's a tough place to be, right? Because you can't ever, I'll say this, just you can't ever be 1,000% sure that you're not hacked. That's a very hard lift, right? You're proving a negative, and IT infrastructure is so vast in most cases that you just don't know, right? Yep. But I can't imagine the amount of hours and work that these guys put in at the wrongly accused utility, only for all of their IT and IR and cyber folks come back and be like, I can't find anything. Like, and by the way, the documents that they're sharing, we don't even know where those came from, and like there had to just be this aha moment where they're just like, guys, this isn't us. Like, but leading up until that point had to be immensely stressful. Yeah. We really need our cyber criminals to be accurate if they can. It's very helpful.
Yeah, exactly. and until the information started getting released online and people were kind of looking at it, people started reporting on it and showing that there was actually documents and information that referenced a completely different company, emails, names, things like that from completely different companies. Yeah. The security research community was like, wait a minute, are these guys talking about the right company? Mm-hmm. And then, so ensues kind of the roasting of this ransomware game and memes and all sorts of interesting stuff. So yeah, I'm not sure what they would have to gain by claiming it was another company when they actually,
I think it was a mistake. It's the only thing that makes sense was like, oops,
right?
We meant that other guy.
Which is puzzling to me how you can spend months and months in an environment and not know, whose environment that is.
Sure.
But here we are, this Clop ransomware gang, prolific gang, not really knowing which end is up, I guess.
It doesn't surprise me. It shouldn't probably be surprising to anybody that they're humans like the rest of us, and they're going to have a couple of goofball moments.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's a scary thing though, that they were in there with access to the water controls. That's happened to us a couple of times on pen tests, and when we were doing critical infrastructure, where we were, just kind of hopping along and having a good time, and then suddenly we realized we're looking at the interface to something very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And we of course stop and call everybody and say, guys. So
yeah, and I was watching a webcast just the other day, and it was by John Strand and the folks over there, and they were talking about kind of the war stories of pen testing. And we've had these same situations where we will do a pen test, we'll get access to something, and the company will be like, yeah, okay, that's fine, great, and then we keep going, we're getting further and further and further, and then all of a sudden we get like a spreadsheet with passwords in it, or somebody's financial or the salaries, right, of the employees at the organization, and then everything stops, right? It's like, hold the phone, like, you got what? Meanwhile, we're over here like able to like turn the dials and like manipulate things.
Sure.
But it goes back to what's important to the organization, what's important to them and their business and things like that. But yeah, it's an interesting case, and definitely a lot of lessons learned here.
We need to do a war stories podcast, because I have some awesome ones. I know you do too. You and I have joint tag teamed a couple of folks in the last year or so that I think make for great stories.
Yep.
We should do that sometime soon. I think it'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, folks, that's all we have for you today. If you enjoyed this episode or you got value from it, the biggest thing you can do to help us out is share that with your friends and your coworkers. We want to get the word out and reach as many people as we can. So give us a rating on your favorite app, like, subscribe, follow, all that jazz, and have a great weekend.